The Kaio was not born from greatness. She was born from necessity, an afterthought in the collapsing dreams of a once rising empire. When Japan entered the Second World War, its ambitions were towering, and its navy was unmatched in the Pacific. Mighty battleships like the Yamato and massive fleet carriers like the Akagi stole the headlines. But as war dragged on and metal grew scarce, Japan turned to improvisation. And in 1942, in the shipyards of Nagasaki, an old German-built oiler began a strange metamorphosis. She was originally named the Argentina Maru, a civilian passenger cargo ship with no dreams of warfare. But by mid-war, dreams were a luxury. The Japanese Navy, bleeding ships faster than it could build them, ordered her conversion into a light aircraft carrier. The process was not elegant. Her hull was narrow, her speed was modest, her flight deck, though respectable in size, had no hangar below, just a flat surface on which to land and launch a few desperate aircraft. She was renamed Kaio, meaning ocean sun or ocean hawk, depending on your kanji, and given just enough firepower to defend herself in theory, but not enough to survive a serious engagement. Her mission was not to dominate battlefields. It was to support, to shuttle aircraft, to train pilots. She was essentially a glorified floating runway. When she was launched in 1943, there was no ceremony of triumph, no sea of waving flags or cheering crowds. The war had turned. The tide was pulling against Japan, and the Kaio, small and converted, knew she would never be a star in the Imperial Navy's story, but even the smallest pieces can matter, especially when everything else is falling apart. In her early months, Kaio mostly served as a transport. She carried aircraft between Japan and its dwindling Pacific holdings. She delivered Zeros to Taiwan. She trained new pilots in home waters. Sometimes she served as a decoy to distract American submarines from more valuable targets. She was many things, but never quite essential. Still, she had her moments. Her deck saw the footsteps of young men who would never come back. Her engines hummed through the East China Sea, carrying dreams that had no future. Her crew, like many others in those final war years, knew they were holding the line against inevitability. There was a strange dignity in her mediocrity. While other carriers like the Shokaku and Zuikaku were being torn apart in epic battles, the Kaio floated quietly, uncelebrated, almost invisible. But perhaps that was the point. Not every ship gets to be a legend. Some are just meant to be there when no one else can be. She was equipped with a modest complement of aircraft, perhaps a dozen or so, typically including trainer planes, scout bombers, or whatever was available. Her anti-aircraft guns were placed wherever space allowed. She lacked armor, she lacked speed, but she had resolve. And in the eyes of her crew, resolve was the only thing left. Her captain knew better than to seek glory. Every mission was calculated, cautious, under the radar. Avoiding American subs became a daily exercise. Flying under cloud cover, hugging coastlines, rerouting constantly. These were the tactics of survival, not victory. And yet, she survived longer than most. As Japan's other carriers fell one by one, Kaio remained. She became a floating ghost in the archipelago, a vessel not designed for victory, but made for endurance. She was light, but she was useful. She didn't win battles, but she saved resources. In a war where steel was precious and young men were being sent to die with bamboo spears, Kaio was what the empire could still afford. In this way, she represented the reality of late-war Japan better than any supercarrier. She wasn't what the Navy wanted. She was what it had left. And perhaps that's why she matters. She shows us what war looks like when the myth begins to fall apart, when even empires are forced to improvise, when luxury liners become training platforms, when the sea is no longer a stage for glory, but a mirror reflecting desperation. The Kaio didn't go out in a blaze of fire, not yet, but her time was coming. By 1944, the Kaio's role had begun to shift. The carrier was no longer just a humble transport for aircraft or a floating training platform. Japan's war machine had begun its descent into fatalistic measures, and the skies above the Pacific were now filled with a grim new weapon, the kamikaze. Young men, barely trained, were being prepared not to fight, but to die. And Kaio, unassuming as she was, became one of the places where they learned how to do just that. It is a strange thing to think of a ship training people to die, But that was the reality. The flight deck that once received curious cadets eager to learn navigation or dive bombing became the last stretch of steel many ever touched. From Cayo, young pilots practiced takeoffs in the same planes they would later crash deliberately into American ships. There were no return landings. Their mission profiles didn't include survival. Cayo's calm waters and relatively isolated location in the inland sea made her an ideal spot for this kind of preparation. She didn't need to venture far. The war was coming closer. American submarines prowled nearby. Aircraft carriers from the U.S. Navy now dominated the Pacific with brutal efficiency. But Cayo remained, nestled near Kure, quietly facilitating what would become one of the most controversial tactics in modern warfare. Her crew changed too. Many of the original sailors had been reassigned, injured, or lost on other ships. New faces appeared, some grizzled veterans, others boys who looked like they should be in school. There was a heaviness aboard the ship, one not found in strategic battle maps or fleet deployments. It came from the knowledge that the men launched from her deck were not expected to come home. Even in her humble form, Cayo bore witness to the breakdown of strategy and the rise of despair. Japan was not winning, it was bracing for impact. And the kamikaze program, born out of desperation and nationalism, required carriers like Cayo not to win battles, but to stage the final act. The irony was sharp. Cayo had no armored deck, no hangar bay. She couldn't support long-term operations or stand toe-to-toe with enemy fleets. But in the twilight of the war, she didn't need to. All she had to do was launch, one mission at a time. Each morning aboard the ship, routine still reigned. Officers barked orders, sailors cleaned decks, engineers checked the engines. But beneath the surface, figuratively and literally, there was a growing sense that time was running out. The aircraft launched were fewer, supplies ran thinner, and the war reports coming in from the Philippines, from Okinawa, from Iwo Jima, they all told the same story. The storm was approaching. Still, some moments aboard Cayo defied the gloom. Pilots joked, sailors played music on battered radios, letters from home were read out loud to friends. Even in the final days, life aboard ship clung to something ordinary. Perhaps because acknowledging the weight of what was happening would have been too much. When Cayo took part in training flights near Kyushu in the inland sea, the skies above her became corridors of memory. Many of the planes didn't even have proper landing gear. They were modified for one-way trips. The men inside were told they would die heroes, that their sacrifice would save the nation, that they were Japan's final hope. Cayo launched them into the horizon. She didn't see their end, but she carried the burden of their beginning. As American forces crept closer to Japan's mainland, Kure Naval Base, the great pride of the Imperial Navy, became both sanctuary and target. Cayo, now battered by time and the weight of her role, lingered in these waters like a shadow. Her commanders knew she couldn't escape what was coming. But until that moment arrived, she continued to do her duty, not as a weapon of victory, but as a conveyor belt for sacrifice. By late 1944, the carrier had taken minor damage during Allied air raids. She was patched, repaired, and sent back into coastal waters. But each repair was slower than the last. Supplies were dwindling, trained crew were in short supply, and so she did what many ships did in those final months. She floated, functioned, and faded. Cayo's history is not told in glorious battles or cinematic sinkings. Her story is in the quiet takeoffs, the final waves, the engineers watching the horizon as planes disappeared. She was never meant to be more than a support ship, but in the last chapter of Japan's naval war, she became a launching pad for the ultimate sacrifice. And that, too, is a kind of tragedy. By mid-1945, the Imperial Japanese Navy was, for all practical purposes, a ghost fleet. What remained of its once proud carriers and battleships lay rusting, submerged, or hiding in home ports. Kure Naval Base, the stronghold where ships like Yamato and Cayo had once gathered with pride, now awaited the inevitable with silence. And in that silence, Cayo lingered, still floating, still breathing, though barely. In July of that year, the Americans launched Operation Kikusui, a relentless bombing campaign designed to finish what had already begun. The skies above Kure were ripped open by waves of B-24 Liberators and carrier-based aircraft from Task Force 38. Their mission was simple: destroy everything that floated. Caillou, moored close to the docks and already nursing the wounds of near-constant use, was not overlooked. On July 24, 1945, American dive bombers found her. She was hit not once but several times, bombs detonating against her exposed deck, igniting fires and collapsing what little structural confidence remained. She did not capsize, nor did she explode in dramatic fashion like the Akagi or Amagi, but she was broken, scarred deeply, crippled, and rendered unusable. She settled quietly in the shallow waters of the harbor. Smoke rose from her deck, curling into the summer air like a final breath. No longer capable of launching planes, no longer able to flee. Caillou had become what many ships in the late stages of war inevitably became, a ruin with a name. In the days that followed, Japan would begin its final collapse. Less than a month later, the bombs would fall on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. The emperor would speak, and the war would end. But Caillou, silent in Coors Bay, had already experienced her ending. Her hull, partly submerged, partly exposed to the sun, became a symbol not of defeat, but of what desperation and endurance looked like side by side. Unlike Yamato, she had not gone down in a blaze of glory. She hadn't traveled far from home. She had not won a single battle of note, yet she had lasted. Through kamikaze training, through fuel shortages, through wave after wave of air raids. And now she waited, a wounded witness to surrender. The American occupation forces arrived later that year. Their engineers and salvage teams walked the decks of the sunken and scorched. Among them, the battered form of Caillou, rusting, forgotten, yet still floating in the harbor she never left. There was no attempt to restore her. She was beyond utility. The war she had been built to support was gone. Instead, she became scrap. In 1947, 2 years after the guns fell silent, Caillou was formally struck from the Naval Register and broken up for parts. Steel was now needed for rebuilding, not warfare. Her hull was dismantled, piece by piece, and with it disappeared one of the quietest carriers in history. She left behind no great battle record, no ace pilots, no medal-covered admirals. She left behind rust marks in the dock and a few faded photographs. And perhaps that's what makes her important. Caillou represents not the glory of war, but its residue. The things we cobble together when there's nothing left. The people we send when we've run out of plans. The ships we launch not to win, but to endure. In the museums and documentaries about the Imperial Japanese Navy, she is rarely mentioned. When she is, it's in passing, a footnote about a converted liner that carried kamikazes and got bombed in Kure. But history, if it's honest, owes a space to ships like Caillou, the overlooked, the unglamorous, the necessary. Because in the end, war is not made of heroes alone. It is made of the silent decks, the tired crew, the floating platforms that carried so many towards a fate no one wanted to speak aloud. Caillou never tried to be more than she was, and somehow that's what makes her unforgettable. Today, if you walk along the coast of Kure, once the heart of Japan's naval ambition, you'll find little trace of Caillou. Her steel was hauled away, her name rarely spoken. The shipyard that once refitted her now builds cargo vessels for trade, not war. The bay is calmer now, its waters home to fishing boats, ferries, and the occasional visitor taking in the view of a place that once roared with engines and echoed with the sharp orders of naval officers. But even if Caillou no longer floats, her story lingers, quietly, in shadows, in the salt of the sea. There's no grand monument dedicated solely to her. She isn't featured in the large-scale models or oil paintings displayed at the Yamato Museum, just a few blocks from the old naval base. The spotlight naturally falls on her more famous siblings, Yamato, Musashi, Akagi. Those ships were giants. Caillou was not. She was the background, the supporting act, but just as essential. And in many ways, that's the tragedy and the honor of her story. In recent years, maritime historians have begun to revisit these forgotten vessels, not because they fought the most battles or bore the most medals, but because they carried the human side of war. The logistical backbone, the desperate adaptations, the quiet duty. Caillou is a perfect example of how a ship, modest in design, can still carry heavy burdens. Some of her crew survived the war and returned to the port where she had once been moored. A few wrote down their memories, short passages about drills on the flight deck, about eating rice in metal bowls, about watching young pilots salute before disappearing into the sky. One man recalled sitting on the edge of the deck at sunset, legs dangling, wondering if the war would ever end. For these men, Kayo was not just a ship. She was a moment in time, both a refuge and a reminder of what they were asked to do. And when she was gone, a part of them stayed behind, anchored in Kur's waters. You won't see her outline in the bay anymore. No rusted hull, no twisted steel reaching above the waves. But on certain mornings when the light hits the water just right, locals say the surface shines in a way that almost forms a path, like a runway made of reflections. It's a poetic illusion. But perhaps it's fitting. After all, Kayo was never a ship of war. She was a ship of departure, of farewells, of one-way flights. Today, Kur is a city shaped by remembrance and reinvention. Tourists visit for its naval history, its shipbuilding legacy, its cherry blossoms in spring. Many come to see the giant model of Yamato, perfectly preserved in a vast museum hall. But the spirit of Kayo is harder to find, until you look more closely. It's there in the rust-colored rails by the docks, in the steel beams repurposed into benches and signage. It's there in the black and white photos mounted near the harbor, images of young men in flight suits, of deck crews in the sun, of an unarmored flight deck stretching into the sea. No captions say her name, but those who know recognize her. For some visitors, especially those who've lost someone to war, her absence says more than presence ever could. Kayo reminds us that not all ships go down in flames. Some simply endure until they're no longer needed. And then they fade, quietly, respectfully, almost gratefully. And perhaps that's how Kayo would have wanted it. No grand ending, just peace, at last. It's easy to forget the ones who didn't make headlines. The warships that didn't tip the balance, that weren't commanded by famous admirals, or that didn't vanish in cinematic catastrophe. But in many ways, those are the vessels that tell us the most. Kayo was one of them. She was never meant to be a symbol. And yet, as history unfolded, she became exactly that. A symbol of a nation's last efforts, a reminder of what war costs even before the final battle is fought. She wasn't glamorous, she wasn't famous, but she was real. And that realism, stark, tired, stripped of drama, is what gives her story enduring power. Modern Japan rarely references Kayo by name. Her photos are scarce, her logs are fragmented, and her memory survives mostly in academic texts or the fading recollections of a handful of veterans. But among historians who specialize in maritime warfare, her story is slowly gaining new respect, not because she was powerful, but because she was honest. In Kayo, we see the truth of late-war desperation. We see a passenger ship refitted for violence, a nation converting anything that floats into something that fights. We see sailors and aviators who knew they were likely being sent on missions without return. And yet, they did their duty, not because they believed in victory, but because they had nowhere else to go. She represents a different kind of courage. And as Japan redefines its role in the world, moving from empire to peacekeeper, from militarism to diplomacy, the quiet remnants of ships like Kayo hold particular weight. They ask difficult questions. They remind us what it means when a society exhausts its resources, its ideals, even its future, in the name of war. And they whisper a message that's neither glorifying nor condemning, but simply cautionary. If you visit Kur today, you'll find streets paved over old bunkers, playgrounds built near what were once barracks, and signs in both Japanese and English explaining the city's naval past. There's a careful tone to these displays, neither proud nor ashamed, just reflective. It's in this tone that Kayo lives on. You won't find her on postcards, but you might feel her story in the quiet spaces, the pier where she once docked, the breeze that blows in from the bay, the rusted chains beside the museum. These are not grand memorials. They are subtle echoes. And in many ways, that's the most honest kind. We often think that legacy must be carved in stone or engraved on brass plaques. But sometimes legacy is what remains in the silence, what lingers in the collective memory, even without a name. Kayo's parts may be scattered, melted down, recast, forgotten, but her role in history is not. She is remembered not for what she achieved, but for what she endured. And in that endurance, she teaches us the quiet strength of those who serve without glory. So the next time you hear about mighty battleships or decisive naval clashes, spare a thought for the modest ones. The ships like Caio that bore their burden without fanfare, because they too shaped history. Just beneath the surface. For years, the final resting place of Caio was barely noted. After being beached and left in Cure's shallow waters, the ship was gradually dismantled and forgotten. No formal salvage mission marked her end, no grand ceremony closed her chapter. It was as if the world had agreed to move on quietly, as if Caio herself had slipped beneath the tides of memory just as effortlessly as she once sliced through the sea. But history has a strange way of surfacing again, especially in places like Cure, where the ocean floor is strewn with the metallic bones of a vanished fleet. Divers and maritime researchers, drawn to the area for larger legends like Yamato, occasionally stumbled upon fragments, twisted beams, rusted hatches, engine parts too small to belong to a battleship, yet unmistakably shaped by war. At first, many assumed they were leftovers from auxiliary vessels or supply ships. But as more pieces emerged, a clearer picture formed. By the early 2000s, amateur historians and underwater archaeologists began to suspect that the remains belonged to Caio. She had been there all along, buried in sediment and sea life, surrounded by modern docks and shipping lanes. A ship once built from the husk of another, now herself reduced to fragments, slowly rejoining the story from beneath the surface. Unlike the dramatic rediscoveries of great warships raised from the deep or displayed in giant exhibition halls, Caio's return to history came quietly. There were no headlines or televised recoveries. Instead, her story was pieced together like a puzzle. Ship logs matched to rivet patterns, survivor testimonies aligned with structural diagrams, and sonar scans compared with grainy wartime maps. Bit by bit, the ship reassembled, not in steel, but in understanding. Among the researchers involved in this slow rediscovery was a young Japanese academic named Hiroshi Nakagawa. His doctoral work focused on the overlooked support vessels of the Pacific War. He wasn't looking for Caio specifically, but the more he dug into the archival records, the more her outline haunted the margins of every report. She wasn't a centerpiece, Fahey wrote in a paper. She was a margin note in every chapter. But you can't read the book properly without her own. Nakagawa and his team helped bring new attention to the ship, not by recovering artifacts, but by reconstructing her significance. Their work led to small displays being added to local museums, a section of hull plating, a model made from blueprints, a digital recreation of her flight deck. At last, Caio had a face again. And more importantly, she had context. She was no longer just a minor carrier that didn't matter. She was now seen as part of the network that held Japan's wartime aviation together, however frayed that network had become by the end. Her role in kamikaze training was revisited, not with judgment, but with nuance. Her transformation from a German tanker into a Japanese carrier was re-examined as a case study in improvisation under pressure. What makes Caio's rediscovery unique isn't just the physical fragments. It's the shift in how we interpret them. Once historians sought only the grand tales, decisive battles, heroic last stands, awe-inspiring machines. Now, increasingly, they seek the quiet stories, the ones that fill in the emotional and logistical gaps, the ones that show us how war is waged not just with firepower, but with desperation, adaptation, and routine. And Caio, fragile and improvised, embodies that perfectly. Today, divers can visit the area near her final location, though most of her remains are now either salvaged or buried. There are no large wrecks to swim through, no towering turrets or massive propellers. But if you know where to look, and if you've read the footnotes of history, you might recognize a section of deck plate or a chunk of superstructure embedded in the sand. You might realize that beneath your fins lies a story that was nearly lost. And more than that, you might understand that what makes Caio significant is not how she sank, but that her story rose again. In her rediscovery, we see the value of remembering the forgotten, of giving space to those who serve not with glory, but with quiet resilience. and of recognizing that even the smallest carriers can carry immense weight. When you trace your fingers over a ship's story like Caillou, you're not just feeling the contours of rivets and hulls, you're touching decisions. Political ones, economic ones, human ones. And the weight of those choices lingers in every rusted seam. Caillou's life reminds us that not all legacies are shaped in victory. Some are shaped in necessity. She was not built for glory. She was built because there were no better options left. In a time when Japan's naval dominance had been steadily chipped away, and the grand ambitions of the Yamato class had already proved more symbolic than strategic, Caillou represented something stripped down and raw. Adaptability born of urgency. Her design was not elegant. Her operations were often improvised. Her missions, late in the war, were tinged with a sense of grim finality. Yet within this unassuming vessel lay an invaluable lesson, one that speaks far beyond military doctrine. That lesson is this: sometimes the most important stories are carried by those who did the work nobody wanted to do, in conditions nobody envied, with tools that barely sufficed. There is dignity in that kind of service, and too often it goes unrecorded. Today, as Kura continues its transformation into a place of reflection and education, Caillou's presence is beginning to shape more than research papers. Local teachers reference her in lessons about the city's wartime role, not to glorify conflict, but to give it human shape. Visitors to the Yamato Museum, after admiring the grandeur of Japan's most famous battleship, can now walk a few steps further and see a modest display about Caillou, tucked into a corner, patiently waiting to be discovered. And this feels right. Not every ship should command the spotlight. Some, like Caillou, whisper from the wings, reminding us that history is made not only by titans, but also by the quiet persistence of those who kept going when the script was already written. If you pause by that exhibit, you may find yourself looking at a weathered photograph, black and white, blurred at the edges. A group of young sailors leans against the rail, the deck around them worn but tidy. There's no drama in the image, just a fleeting human moment aboard a ship doing its job. And that, more than anything, is the enduring heart of Caillou, not the shape of her hull, or the number of planes she carried, or the campaigns she supported, but the reminder that in every war and in every era, there are vessels that bear the weight of history without ever asking for attention. We owe them something, not fanfare, not mythology, just remembrance. So if you ever find yourself in Kure, listening to the gulls in the tide, take a moment. Imagine the sound of propellers churning water, the slap of boots on deck, the hum of an engine patched together from mismatched parts. Imagine a ship that was never supposed to last, but did long enough to matter. And in that moment, maybe you'll hear Caillou, not in the roar of war, but in the gentle lapping of waves against a forgotten dock. In the grand narrative of maritime history, it's often the giants, the battleships, the famous victories, the sunken legends that claim our attention. But sometimes it is the quieter vessels like Caillou that carry the weight of our deepest reflections. In the port of Kure, beneath the shadows of shipyards and memory, her story continues, not in grandeur, but in echoes. Caillou was never built to be remembered. She wasn't majestic, she wasn't powerful, yet she was necessary. She sailed through one of the darkest chapters in naval history, an aircraft carrier stitched together from urgency, not ambition. And in doing so, she became a mirror, not of triumph, but of resilience. To walk the docks of Kure today is to stand at the edge of stories half told. There, among rust and water, the spirit of forgotten ships lingers, and Caillou, stripped and silent, becomes a symbol of all the vessels left out of the textbooks, yet never out of meaning. This is the soul of maritime history, not just in what we celebrate, but in what we choose to remember. The fragments, the quiet stories, the lessons left behind by salt and steel. So as we close this chapter, let Caillou remind us, not every ship must be legendary to be important. Some simply had to endure, and in that endurance lies a legacy all its own. We'll meet again in another tide with another vessel waiting to speak.